In this video, I'm going to show you how I add dynamic metadata like SEO meta title, SEO meta description, and open graph images to my Next.js website. All of the links I'm talking about in this video are listed inside of this blog post. So if you prefer reading over listening to my Borat-like accent, go ahead and check it out. Now let's go ahead and look at my code. So in Next.js, you have a function called generate metadata. This function is built especially for setting up metadata in your pages. Inside that function, first, I fetch the relevant data from my backend. In my case, it's a GraphQL request to payload CMS. Then I'm organizing the data according to my needs. And finally, I'm returning the metadata object according to the metadata type that I also get from Next.js right here. One thing to note before moving forward is this fallback. Here, in case my data fetching fails, the function will fall back to the next generate metadata function in the hierarchy, which in my case is inside the root layout of my app. And by the way, you can view the entire code of Whisker that we'll be talking about today in this public repo, and there's a link to it down in the description. Whisker is a platform I created for interviewing experts and brands. I use this channel to share my progress with Whisker and also show how I do things and why. So if you have any comments regarding Whisker, the best place to let me know about them is under the discussions tab in the public repo. Alright, now let's start from the beginning and look at what we're trying to achieve. So here we're looking at an example of a question page on whisker.com. This page consists of a question followed by many answers. If I go to the console inspector and search for title, for example, we can see all of the metadata information this specific page has. For example, here's the title, here is the description, the authors who answered the question, and the open graph image. And as you probably know, this is the info that Google will be showing in the search results. By the way, there's an easier way to inspect the metadata of a page, and it's with an SEO browser extension. I personally use this one called SEO Meta 1 Copy, and I think it's great. All you need to do is click on the extension and you immediately can see the title and the description of the page you're in. As you can see, in my title for this page, it says 8 answers. This part of the title is what you call dynamic, and it will change each time there's a new answer. So how do we implement dynamic metadata in Next.js? Let's look at the documentation. We are under API reference, under functions, and under generate metadata. Next.js allows you to export both static and dynamic metadata. If the metadata for your route is permanent and it isn't going to change, you should only export the metadata object without the function. For example, maybe you have a route only for your about page and you know the title and description are permanent. That means they are static, and therefore you only need to export the metadata object. But if your route metadata is changing, like in my example with the 8 answers, you should definitely use the generate metadata function. And what this function is returning is basically the same object as the static operation, only that in this case it's inside of the function that is async. That way you can fetch data according to the URL params and only then return the metadata object with the fetched data, allowing for a dynamic operation. By the way, you can't use both the dynamic and static operation on the same route, and also that route must be a server component. So that means basically you can't use the use client line at the beginning of your code. Okay, this page has a lot of useful information about the different properties you can use with your metadata object. I definitely advise you to give it a visit. Let's once again look at the code for Whisker question page. First of all, as you can see, this is a server component. And here is my generate metadata function. In the first part, I'm fetching the data from payload CMS, which is the headless CMS that I'm using. Then, if there's no data, I'm returning an empty object. This is actually an important part, and I will get back to it in a second. Next, I'm arranging and defining the data. And lastly, I'm returning the metadata object that we talked about earlier. Let's take a second to look at the meta title. So do you remember the 8 answers I showed you in the browser? As you can see here, in cases where the answer amount is more than 1, and I haven't defined a custom title in the CMS, the meta title I will get will be the question followed by the amount of answers, which is dynamic information I received by fetching data from the server within the async function. Now let's go back and talk about the fallback concept. As we can see here, I return an empty object in case no data was fetched or no relevant question was found. And this is a very important and cool principle of setting up metadata in Next.js. If a route isn't exporting a metadata object, then Next.js will automatically take the metadata from the next segment in the hierarchy. In other words, when you define a metadata object in your page, you are overwriting the metadata object you defined in your root layouts. And this is actually true for each property of the object. So in my case, the fallback is the root layout of my app, because this is the next place I define a metadata object. As you can see in my root layout, I'm exporting the metadata using the static metadata object. This is because the information here is permanent and I'm also not fetching anything. So how the fallback works in my case is that the metadata object properties defined in the question page are overriding the properties defined here. And in case the question page generate metadata function is returning an empty object, all of the properties will be taken from here. So, for example, if I define the application name here in the root layout, it will appear in all of my pages unless I override it. Here in the browser, you can see it in my question page, even though I didn't define it inside of the route. And that's pretty much it. If you have any comments or questions regarding how I do things on Whisker, the best place to communicate them is on Whisker's public repo under the discussion tab. And thank you for watching.